Welcome to the SWOG Cancer Research Network Fall 2021 virtual group meeting. As you've perhaps noticed, once again, we are not in Chicago, and once again, our group meeting seems mostly to be taking place on a computer or iPhone screen. I do want to remind you of how beautiful the city of Chicago is. I myself grew up there, and I hope we're back in 2022. None of our speakers today has disclosures. Here's my agenda for today. I'll cover welcomes and farewells, update you on important and exciting group news and accomplishments, recognize Hope Foundation programs and awardees, and then turn to introducing our plenary speakers and panel. I'll start with welcomes and farewells. Our first farewell is to our outgoing Melanoma Committee Chair, Dr. Ken Grossman. Dr. Grossman was nurtured in our Young Investigators training course and has led our melanoma efforts since Dr. Tony Rebus left us for the much less important job of running AACR. Ken clearly laid the groundwork for a new generation of melanoma studies. I thank him for his leadership and for his expert guidance of study S1404 of immunotherapy in patients with high-risk melanoma, the results of which he presented at ASCO this summer. With Ken's departure, we are lucky to have someone ready to step up, who is already providing outstanding leadership within the Melanoma Committee. Dr. Sapna Patel of the MD Anderson Cancer Center was study chair of the S1801 trial and a co-chair on S1404. I have asked her to be chair of the Melanoma Committee, and she has accepted. We look forward to her continued melanoma leadership. To smooth the transition, Drs. Patel and Grossman are co-leading the melanoma sessions at this group meeting. Next, we bid a fond and perhaps slightly tearful, though I maintain I'm suffering from allergies, farewell to someone who has contributed enormously to growing SWOG's international reach, particularly throughout Latin America. Dr. Alejandro Mojar has served as SWOG's Executive Officer for International Affairs, and his work on the SWOG Latin America Initiative has brought us new members in Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and Uruguay. In a few minutes, I'll show you a slide of our top accruing sites over the past year, but as a preview, I'll tell you now that on that list is Dr. Mojar's institution, known as INCAN, described as Mexico's National Cancer Institute. This is the first time this institution, or any institution outside of the U.S., has been on this list, and it's largely a testament to the commitment and effort of Dr. Mojar. He has also greatly strengthened our research connections in Latin America and extended our training opportunities there. He oversaw a number of educational symposia SWOG conducted with significant local help in Mexico and South America. Dr. Mojar, we are so grateful for your work. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our new Executive Officer for International Affairs, Dr. Mariana Chavez McGregor of the MD Anderson Cancer Center. Dr. Chavez McGregor is well known for her work with SWOG's Breast Committee, where she led S1207, developing the concept within the Hope Foundation-supported Young Investigators training course, and guiding it through successful completion of accrual. She sits on the Hope Executive Board, helping guide efforts by our most important fundraising arm. She is incredibly hardworking and dedicated, and has already hit me up for a detailed vision statement about what I want to bring to the table regarding SWOG in Latin America, in a good way. Dr. Chavez McGregor is a leader with deep roots in Latin America and a vigorous international network of connections in the oncology research community there. I know she will continue to strengthen the collaborations between SWOG and all our international partners. We're delighted to have you in this new role, Dr. Chavez McGregor. Now we move on to important news and accomplishments. I'll start with an item that fits in both categories, news and accomplishments. This is a result presented at ESMO last month that all of us, as the cooperative groups and members of the NCI's National Clinical Trials Network, can be enormously proud of. Dr. Joe Unger, working with data provided by all 4 adult U.S. cooperative groups, has quantified the benefits of 40 years of NCTN treatment trials. Our studies that reported positive results between 1980 and 2020 have added 14 million years to the lives of people with cancer. 14 million years is a long time. Look at these continental changes. What's more, this number of added life years is expected to continue to grow at an astounding rate, so that by 2030, our results will have added more than 23 million years. This project was a collaborative effort with all the NCTN adult American groups, and I am pleased to say we were asked to present our findings at the ECOG group meeting plenary session. Of course, we scooped them by discussing it here first. Dr. Unger's work also reports on the enormous impact NCTN trial results have had on subsequent cancer research and on treatment guidelines. Published results of the 163 trials he identified have been cited in the literature more than 166,000 times, and 80% of those trials have been cited in patient care guidelines in support of recommended treatments. I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on this number whenever any doubt about the value of the work you do every day in oncology research creeps in. One of the final pieces of news to come out of our spring group meeting was the vote by our Board of Governors to promote our Veterans Affairs Working Group to our Veterans Affairs Committee, still under the exemplary leadership of Stephen Bartlett. SWOG's newest research support committee continues to expand veterans' access to cancer clinical trials. It also, among its other activities, works with the Hope Foundation to oversee our VA Integration Awards, which over the past few years have provided 20 VA medical centers across the country the support they need to make NCTN trials available to our veterans. Congratulations to all the members of the new VA committee on a well-deserved promotion. At our spring meeting plenary, I told you about work underway by our Protocol Resourcing Task Force, led by SWOG Deputy Chair Primo Lucky Lara, to more equitably and efficiently allocate our protocol development and statistical resources for developing new trials. That task force has since presented to SWOG's Executive Advisory Committee a set of 4 recommendations we are now working to implement. These changes include a new interactive protocol development dashboard our committee chairs can use to track protocols and plan for new concepts. The slide at left shows a view of this dashboard. A metric to measure the level of complexity of each proposed study concept. A fixed slot model for fairly assigning protocol development and statistical resources to committees, and a flexible slot mechanism to allow us to allot resources to emerging priorities and to selected research support committees. Thank you, Dr. Lara, and the many members of this task force who worked so hard to improve our processes. 2020 was a year defined by COVID, and SWOG enrollment took a major hit in the spring months. But research out of our Statistics and Data Management Center, published this summer, finds enrollment to our treatment trials recovered quickly during the summer of 2020, and since then has remained near or at normal levels. This quick recovery was thanks in large part to major changes by the NCI that allowed greater flexibility in telehealth visits, in remote consenting, in sending oral agents directly to patients, and more. These changes were rolled out quickly, and their effect on the conduct of trials was rapid. Thanks to them, throughout the first year of the pandemic, our trials continued to advance our knowledge of how to improve the lives of our patients. In January of this year, I declared 2021 to be SWOG's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Year of Action. Since then, we've had lots of DEI movement, all with the support of the Hope Foundation, and some of it with added support from Genentech. First in the spring, we brought in Pope Consulting, a DEI firm with an absolutely stellar client list, to help us refine our strategy for making SWOG's leadership, membership, and staff more diverse and more inclusive. That work is nearing completion and will feature an inclusive leadership training session later this month for many SWOG leaders and staff, and a strategic planning workshop next month to learn more about Pope's findings and to develop strategies for implementing their recommendations. Also in the spring, with the Hope Foundation, we awarded our first DEI Career Development Award to Dr. Patricia Robinson of Loyola University. Dr. Robinson is leading a network-wide project to increase the diversity of our clinical trials. More recently, we advertised to bring on board a group of DEI champions to implement strategies at the level of individual committees and protocols to make our trials more successful at enrolling groups of participants who represent the full diversity of the populations of patients with cancer. These and other DEI efforts are changing SWOG for the better, but we want to go further. To ensure the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion are consistently championed at the highest levels and are integrated into all we do, we have decided to establish a SWOG Vice Chair for DEI. This person will lead the development and implementation of DEI initiatives and training across SWOG to foster inclusion and diversity at all levels of our research and operations. We have formed a search committee led by SWOG Vice Chair for NCOR Research, Dr. Dawn Hirschman, co-led by HOPE President Joe Horn, and managed by SWOG Assistant Director for Administration Casey Dawson, which is now hard at work identifying the most promising candidates for this position. I'm sure that at our next group meeting plenary, I will be introducing to you our new Vice Chair for DEI. Finally, in this DEI Year of Action, there's one additional personal action I've taken. As you all know, I'm fond of a joke, and those of you who have attended one of my past group meeting plenary updates know I've carried out a precedent established by our past chair, wherein in a certain group, which I am a member of, is often featured. Those who know me know I love Seinfeld, and some of you may remember Jerry's dentist converted to Judaism just because he liked the joke so much. I've also used the fact that I'm Jewish to justify these jokes, but I've become increasingly uncomfortable with that stance. A joke at the expense of a particular group is still at that group's expense, regardless of who is telling it, and it promotes stereotypes. It's not in line with SWOG values. So I am hereby retiring my scheduled amusing story. I may try for a few laughs, but hopefully less offensive ones. Back to accomplishments. One accomplishment we love to recognize is extraordinary enrollment by our sites to SWOG trials. From July 2020 through June 2021, these sites were our top accruers. Among main members and LAPS institutions, the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, the University of Southern California Norris Comprehensive Cancer Center, the University of Rochester, the National Cancer Institute of Mexico, or INCAN, and the University of Utah Huntsman Cancer Institute. Among our NCOR member sites, the Southeast Clinical Oncology Research Consortium NCOR, the Kaiser Permanente NCOR, the Heartland Cancer Research NCOR, the Cancer Research Consortium of West Michigan NCOR, and the Gulf South Minority Underserved NCOR. Thank you to all these institutions and to all of you who work so hard to accrue to trials that advance care for our patients. My final piece of news concerns the SWOG Clinical Trials Partnerships. SWOG CTP is the mechanism we use to partner with industry to conduct important, non-federally funded clinical trials. We've recently established the Preferred Partnerships Program to enhance these efforts. The PPP forms long-term alliances with industry partners that focus on the partner's drug pipeline, often through complex multi-arm platform trials, all aspects of which are jointly governed by CTP and the partner company. Under the leadership of SWOG Vice Chair for Clinical Trials Partnerships, Dr. Kathy Albane, CTP has been going great guns in recent months. We signed its first preferred partnership contract with Novartis Pharmaceuticals. This collaborative research agreement will see SWOG CTP and Novartis jointly developing and conducting Phase 2 and Phase 3 clinical trials with investigational drugs from Novartis's deep pipeline and SWOG's scientific leadership, initially in leukemia. This is new ground for SWOG CTP, and we're excited by the possibilities. I expect to see great things from this partnership, which will obviously supplement and enhance, in a scientifically meaningful way, our federally based efforts. It won't replace them. The Hope Foundation for Cancer Research is the heart that drives so much of what makes SWOG unique. Of course, Hope can't support SWOG if we don't support Hope. So to encourage that support, I'm initiating a new top 10 list as part of my plenary presentation. I'll thank the top 10 donors to the Hope Foundation from the previous year. The top donors to Hope from 2020 are listed here alphabetically. An anonymous donor, William Barlow, David Gendera, Julie Graylow, the Harms Family Fund, Barry Levine, Shirley Livingston, Benjamin Marcello, Robert Orlowski, Raymond Ozorogiobin, the Shield Family Fund, Debu and Becky Tripathi, and Mark Zalewski. You may have noticed there are more than 10 names listed here. That's because of ties. Thank you to these extraordinary donors and to all of you who've given to Hope. Make your donation now, and maybe we'll see your name on this list at our spring meeting. I also want to thank the outgoing members of the Hope Foundation's Board of Directors. All 3 of these members have served 2 3-year terms and have contributed enormously to the success of the Foundation and its programs. The outgoing board members are Dr. Jason Zell, who has chaired the Charles Coatman Jr. Fellowship Review Committee during his entire tenure as a board member, Dr. Lee Ellis, who has served as vice chair of the Foundation. Dr. Ellis has been a key member of the Hope Executive Committee and has been a tireless advocate for the Foundation itself. Dr. Mike LeBlanc, who has advocated for and informed the Hope Board about the integration of SWOG Statistical and Data Management Center in SWOG trials and Hope grants. I thank all of you for your faithful service to the Hope Foundation and to SWOG. I usually announce a number of Hope Awards at the fall plenary. Unfortunately, the pandemic's fallout has delayed the Foundation's award review processes this fall, but it has not grounded hope. Award applications have come in and are being reviewed, and announcements will be made soon. One Hope-supported program that has completed its review process for this year is our prestigious Young Investigators Training course, which selected the following outstanding early career researchers. Manali Bavey of Emory University. Dr. Bavey's proposed study will be conducted within the Breast Committee. Julia McGinnis of Columbia University. Dr. McGinnis's trial will be conducted under the auspices of the Prevention and Epidemiology Committee. Dr. Deepak Pruthi of the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio. Dr. Pruthi's study will be carried out within the GU Committee. Angel Chin of the University of Michigan. Dr. Chin's study will be done within the Lung Committee. And our final awardee was named a Young Investigator in 2020, but postponed his participation until this year. He is Javier Reytamales of the Chilean Cooperative Group for Oncologic Research, and his study will take place in the Symptom Control and Quality of Life Committee. COVID meant that last year's course had to be a virtual event. As 2021 progressed, we had high hopes we would bring together this group of young investigators in Seattle, in person, in September. Rising infection rates in late summer forced us to postpone, but we were hoping for a hybrid, part virtual, part in-person young investigator training course at a later date. I also want to mention a Hope-supported opportunity that is still open for applications. The NCORE Pilot Grant Program to improve participation of underrepresented populations in clinical trials. Hope will make awards of up to $50,000 for proposals to build infrastructure or test interventions that will improve access to clinical trials for underserved populations. The program is looking for solutions that could scale across the NCTN, and the next application deadline is December 1st. Visit the Hope website to learn more. Finally, believing in better times to come is the essence of Hope, and looking forward to next year, the Hope Foundation has budgeted a total of more than $3 million to fund SWOG research and initiatives in 2022. Holy cow. Our review processes may have been slowed, but the extent of support the Foundation provides is as great as ever. We now move on to the main part of our program. Earlier this year, partly in response to an extended discussion in the cancer research community about sexual harassment and coercion and other unprofessional behavior, we pledged to hold another of our Crucial Conversations panels to address this topic directly. This is that panel. We'll open with 3 presentations on aspects of the topic, then convene a panel discussion that will also take your questions in real time. Our first speaker is Dr. Reshma Jagzi, a longtime SWOG member from the University of Michigan, who is a leading international researcher on the topic of gender inequity in medicine, a subject she will present on today. Dr. Jagzi, the floor is yours.
I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present in this very important plenary session. What I'll be discussing is an evidence-based approach to fulfilling our duty to promote gender equity in oncology. I'll begin by articulating deontological and teleological arguments for the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion within the medical profession. I'll review the evidence regarding causal mechanisms of inequity, focusing on equity for women in medicine as the example. And then I will discuss the types of interventions that can target the root causes of inequity. So we do have an ethical imperative to act here. There are two types of moral arguments that can be made to support the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion. The first is what's known as a deontological argument. Deontological arguments are grounded in the theories of Immanuel Kant, the idea that human beings have a certain fundamental dignity that arises from our capacity for rational thought and freely willed action, and that dignity merits respect for its own sake. And we must, in order to demonstrate that respect for persons qua persons, act in ways that ensure fair equality of opportunity to highly sought after and influential positions like leadership positions in academic medicine. This is the kind of argument that says equity is important because equity is important for its own sake, right? It's the right thing to do. We have a duty to respect one another. There are also powerful teleological arguments. Teleological arguments are consequence-based, consequentialist arguments, ones that look at what results from pursuing equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so if you think about the fact that in academic medicine, we have a tripartite mission, typically we talk about our educational mission, our research mission, and our clinical care mission, then you can also make a teleological argument that says, hey, 50% of medical students today are women. We need women in senior and influential positions to serve as role models for all those young women that are training in the field. We can also make that argument with respect to the research mission. There is abundant data that has been collected by social scientists over the ages that has shown that when you bring people together with vastly different life backgrounds and experiences and you allow them to interact, that diversity actually improves science. It improves the rigor of the questions we ask, the methods that we use, and our collective intelligence, our ability to solve those complex problems. And finally, perhaps the most compelling teleological argument for DEI in medicine actually is that diversity, equity, inclusion in medicine actually improves our ability to serve our patients. And there are a number of studies that have shown that bringing people with different perspectives to the table is essential for us to serve our patients. Now, we know that women in oncology have been a growing share of the members of the field. You can see here, it's different for different subspecialties. And so radiation oncology lags behind hematology oncology, which is almost at parity in terms of trainees and really close in terms of faculty as well. However, in all fields of oncology, women are underrepresented and in the very small minority in positions of influence and authority, like leadership positions of serving as chair or program director. And you can see here that we've looked at other positions of influence and authority in medicine more generally. This is the very first study that I ever led in this area, looking at women's representation amongst authors of research, of invited editorials, of editorial board members, finding that women were in the small minority. And you can say, yeah, but you're getting kind of old there, Dr. Jagsy. That was 15 years ago. Well, unfortunately, this has been replicated time and time again over the past 15 years. And in fact, within the field of oncology, by my colleague, Dr. Yalamanchali, who has shown women's underrepresentation in the most influential positions of authorship. And in fact, if you look at clinical trials authorship, given this audience, you can see that women's highest representation is in the second author position, and its lowest representation is in the senior author position. So what are the causal mechanisms at work here? Well, there are challenges that are disproportionately borne by women: unconscious bias, sexual harassment, and the gendered division of domestic labor that lead to this inequity in access to positions that are influential in our field. And this has been detailed in the field of oncology by Dr. Duma and colleagues, who did an incredibly important study that shows that women speaking at the ASCO annual meetings are less likely to get introduced with their doctor title and their formal introduction than men. And we know that overt discrimination and harassment also occur. This is a general study that I led 5 years ago now that has shown just how frequently individuals in medicine who were physician researchers were reporting bias and harassment. And Dr. Subia later in this session will present results specific to oncology, where we have used ASCO's survey research pool to further inform our understanding of the prevalence and the impact of harassment in the field of oncology specifically. And then I said there were gendered expectations regarding the division of domestic labor. And of course, never before has that been more apparent than during the COVID-19 pandemic. This was actually a study before the COVID-19 pandemic where we asked people how they were spending their time. These were recipients of NIHK awards, really promising physician researchers, among whom the hours of parenting and domestic tasks were substantially longer for the women in the sample. And when we asked them, my favorite question in this study was, what do you do when your usual childcare arrangements fall apart? And no, I was not thinking about the Ann Arbor Public Schools shutting down from March of 2020 till May of 2021, which is actually what they did. I was thinking about snow days or a nanny being too sick to come in or a kid being too sick to go to daycare. But in any case, the finding is quite compelling and, of course, has been borne out by experience during the pandemic. 43% of the women and 12% of the men said they dealt with that disruption themselves. And so there have been a series of reports from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine that have gone through these challenges and compiled the abundant evidence that we have and identified promising practices to address these challenges. What these reports have in common is that they apply an intersectional lens, which is so important because although I'm using gender as the example here, and I am crudely referring to men and women as if there's only two categories, which of course we know is not the case, we all know that there are many groups that have been historically marginalized in our society and in our field. And Kimberly Crenshaw has given us this concept of intersectionality that recognizes that you can't simply add up the experiences of racism and sexism to understand what the compounded impact is on a Black woman in America today. Ultimately, what we must do is recognize that the causal mechanisms here are bidirectional, so that not only are unconscious bias, sexual harassment, and the gender division of domestic labor factors that contribute to gender inequity, but gender inequity is in fact the environment within which those behaviors thrive. And so there is a famous metaphor of an iceberg of sexual harassment that I'm sure Dr. Subia is going to show you in detail. And the idea is that we focus on the tip of the iceberg, those egregious, very clear incidences of sexual coercion or unwanted sexual attention, and we miss the far more frequent instances of gender harassment that lie beneath the surface and yet can have equally detrimental impact on the endpoints we care about: physical well-being, mental well-being, professional well-being of our colleagues. And so what we must do is look at what factors lie in the water. What's causing that iceberg to form in the first place? And as you can see here, we actually have great understanding of what those factors are so we can target them. This is complex. This is a little bit like the drivers of cancer. This is multifactorial, but if we think we can rid the world of the fear of cancer, I think we can also rid the world of sexism and racism and inequity. We have to learn from the evidence. And we're very good at this. We're oncologists, right? So what do we need to do? We need to fix the systems. We need not to be focusing on the individuals, but rather having changes in recognition at institutional levels, including the development of mentorship and sponsorship programs, evidence-based implicit bias training, cultural transformation initiatives, and the institution of transparent and consistent criterion-based evaluation, promotion, and compensation processes. We have a wonderful opportunity to leverage social media to connect with one another. It was not that long ago that many individuals felt like the only. And now, thanks to social media, we can come together and we can actually promote change. If we don't act, then that current medical school class that is 50% female will have retired by the time we reach equality in terms of the number of male and female medical school deans. So we have a wonderful opportunity right now. So COVID-19 has certainly been a disruption. Many of the events of the past couple of years have been a disruption. And yet, as we know, not all disruptions are negative, and disruption can provide an opportunity for change. And so I really encourage you particularly to read the work by my colleagues Bridget Keenan and Catherine Van Loon on pragmatic solutions that can counteract the regressive effects of the pandemic that we're observing for women in academic oncology and for other historically marginalized groups. There are promising practices that exist, that are out there, that have been summarized in many, many pieces over the past year. And we inhabit a momentous time right now. We have this opportunity to move from the awareness of the problem to action to promote equity using evidence-based approaches. And many of the concepts and strategies to promote equity for women may also be useful to promote equity for other historically marginalized groups. And we are so well positioned to do this as oncologists. We can apply the familiar healthcare quality improvement framework and plan, do, study, act so that we continuously innovate and evaluate and ultimately improve structures, processes, and outcomes. Thank you very much for your attention and for the organizers of this meeting for recognizing the importance of this issue as central to the ethical practice of oncology. Thank you again for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Jagsi. Our second speaker is Dr. Ishwarya Subboya of the MD Anderson Cancer Center, whose research into sexual harassment among oncologists provided a good deal of the raw material that went into that extended discussion on the topic earlier this year, and she will share some of what she has learned with us now. Dr. Subboya, please go ahead.
Thank you very much to the SWOG Executive Committee and Dr. Blanke specifically for making time for this very important topic in our SWOG plenary for this fall meeting. And understanding the integrity and ethical behavior in cancer research and the overall workplace experience for our stakeholders who participate in cancer research in any capacity will be crucial for the future of a sustainable oncologic workforce. And to that end, in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to speak about a study that we completed just this past year, and it explores the oncologist experience with sexual harassment. What this is this study leverages the ongoing broader cultural movement in where elements of a person's experience as it pertains to sexual harassment are much more openly discussed, and there's a level of accountability and responsibility that historically has been absent. And so in this context, we use the 2018 landmark document from the National Academies on the influence of sexual harassment in academia. And this particular document provides invaluable information, including defining the different types of sexual harassment. This particular Iceberg reference you may have seen in other circumstances, but it very accurately captures the types of sexual harassment and the examples that fall under each category of sexual harassment. The understanding this becomes important because each domain is what we will measure in our study. And so recognizing that within clinical oncology, there's very limited data on the workplace experience of oncologists. And so understanding and characterizing the issue in granular detail will help inform future policies and steps to protect our workplace. And so in that context, this study is looking to close that gap where we utilize comprehensive, validated measures to investigate experiences of workplace sexual harassment. And so we did a cross-sectional study with ASCO's research survey pool, as well as targeted social media outreach to examine the prevalence, risk factors, and sources of workplace sexual harassment. We ensured the highest quality of study design by taking multiple steps, which I'll go into. The identity validation of the participants. So participants validated their ASCO membership prior to accessing the survey. This is to ensure the authenticity of the respondent, as well as to avoid duplicate responses. And participants were immediately de-identified upon authentication. For this particular study, we focused on physicians who are practicing in a subspecialty of oncology. And so they were either in practice or in training in medical, surgical, GYN, or radiation oncology or hematology. And they were employed full-time at their current workplace in the United States for at least 1 year. And so all participants provided informed consent, and the study was approved through the institutional IRB. So to minimize the response bias, the participants received an invitation that used verbiage consistent with best practices in survey administration. And so this is inviting them to participate in a survey entitled Workplace Experience for Oncologists. This is to make it clear that this is fundamentally what we're measuring, but this is to assure that we don't have a response bias if we included what exactly it is we were looking for in the title of the invitation itself. So the likelihood that somebody responded because this was about sexual harassment was very low because the invitation was informative but also non-specific. When we designed how we are going to measure the experience, we looked to the validated questionnaires whenever possible. This was the highest priority. And so in this context, we used the Sexual Experiences Questionnaire and measured a series of behaviors of each form of the sexual harassment, if you think back to that National Academy's Iceberg. And we looked at this specifically where the perpetrator was an institutional insider, defined as either a peer or a superior. And separately, we also measured sexual harassment from patients and or families. And we specified behaviors that fall under each of these domains. The SEQ itself looks at this is an instrument that's been in use in the psychology worlds for decades. And it's one where if we look a little bit closer at the questions, you get a sense of the type of behaviors that are pinpointed in measuring the different types of sexual harassment. This was an instrument used widely in the United States military through the Department of Defense and many other contexts as well. When we looked at the second part of our study was to look at the downstream impact of the experience of sexual harassment. And so for this purpose, we focused on 4 downstream domains that can be impacted by workplace sexual harassment. This was mental health, job satisfaction, sense of safety at work, as well as turnover intentions. And again, we used validated instruments when possible, and we used questions that have been used in other contexts to study the workplace experience in medicine overall. And so the primary outcome was to describe the incidence of sexual harassment in the previous year among oncology physicians. And I do want to emphasize that the recall period for this was the previous year. It was not reflecting on a lifetime of experience. It was truly what happened in the past year. And we did it and so it was to describe it by the perpetrator as well as by the type of sexual harassment. And so our secondary outcomes included looking at the associations between experiencing sexual harassment and the downstream consequences: mental health, sense of safety at work, job satisfaction, and turnover intentions. And the additional secondary outcomes included to assess the association between the respondent demographics and the experience of harassment in the 4 domains listed above, and after controlling for race, career stage, and specialty, multivariate analysis on the impact of sexual harassment on the 4 domains above. And so let me share our results with you. So of the 1,000 practicing oncologists who were targeted using the ASCO RSP, as well as the participants through the targeted social media outreach, we received 304 respondents who clicked through the survey link. 27% provided responses. And then of these, we identified a cohort for our analytic data set that was 271 cisgender respondents who responded as women or men. And so we did not have trans respondents in this survey. When we looked at the analytic data set of 271 cisgendered respondents, they broke down essentially into 50-50. About 56% were women, 44% were men, 53% were Caucasian. A vast majority were identified as heterosexual, whereas 6% were LGBTQ+. 63% were born in the United States, and 87% of the respondents held US citizenship. Similarly, about 84% were adult medical oncologists and or hematologists. 92% were already in practice, 8% were in training, and 62% were in academia, clinical academia, while 31% had a primary community practice. Over half of the respondents were were 5 years or more beyond their training. So let's look at what we found. The incidence of sexual harassment when the perpetrator was an institutional insider. Of the physicians who responded, 70% reported one or more incidents of sexual harassment by peers or superiors in the previous year. 70% as a whole. When you look by the gender, 80% of the women and 56% of the men reported the same. If you look down by the three subtypes of sexual harassment, you can see that 69% reported gender harassment. This is responding oncologists overall. 17% reported unwanted sexual attention, and 3% reported coercion. The subtypes of harassment, of gender harassment and unwanted sexual attention, were both statistically significant and higher among the women respondents than the male respondents. When we look at the incidence of harassment when the perpetrator is a family member or a patient, 53% of physicians reported one or more incidents in the previous year alone. When you look at it by the gender, 67% of the women respondents reported sexual harassment from patients or families, and 35% of male respondents. When you look at the subtypes of the sexual harassment, you can see that it was predominantly gender harassment, and for gender harassment, the incidence was higher in women than in men oncologists. Now, when we look at the downstream impact of sexual harassment, let's look at it first from institutional insiders. This is the peers and superiors. The multivariate analysis that we conducted showed that sexual harassment from a peer or superior in the past year was significantly associated with decreased mental health, decreased sense of workplace safety, decreased job satisfaction, and increased turnover in tensions. When we look at the downstream impact of sexual harassment from patients and families, we see that those who report experiencing an incident or more of sexual harassment in the past year from patients and families, that cohort was significantly associated with decreased mental health, decreased workplace safety, and increased turnover in tensions. What about when we look at the individual genders? Is there a difference in the downstream impact if you're a male respondent versus a female respondent? So what we saw was that while the incidence between the men and women physicians was different for specific types of sexual harassment, the downstream impact was not. There was no significant difference between men and women respondents when it comes to the downstream impact of experiencing sexual harassment on mental health, job satisfaction, workplace safety, and turnover in tensions, when the perpetrator is an institutional insider. What about if the perpetrator is a patient and family? Does gender matter? What we found were very similar findings. In the domains of mental health, job satisfaction, and turnover in tensions, the event of having experienced sexual harassment in the workplace in the previous year from patients and families, there was not one gender that had a significant difference over another in the downstream impact. The only domain where this difference was significant was in workplace safety. Women respondents reported a lower sense of workplace safety than the male respondents when they reported having experienced harassment in the workplace. So we looked a little bit more at the demographic factors and the downstream impact. In this particular study with this particular population, the respondents' race and ethnicity, their specific oncologic subspecialty, and their career stage, whether they were early, mid-career, or senior faculty members, was not associated with the differences in the downstream impact of sexual harassment, either by insiders within the institution or by patients and families in any of the 4 models that we tested. And so this data becomes critical in conversations on what to do next. Where do we go from here, specifically for the field of oncology? By using validated instruments with precedent in accurately capturing the workplace experience. This is the first such study to provide this level of in-depth data and granularity into the workplace experience. We saw that the impact of sexual harassment on both men and women in the domains of workplace experience was equivalent. There was no significant difference by gender. And so this study provides critical data to inform policies and action that will protect our oncologic workforce. So I appreciate this forum to present this information on behalf of our entire study team of Dr. Markham, Dr. Graff, Ken Griffith, Julia Close, as well as Dr. Matt Amaral and Dr. Jagsy, who's joining us today as well. And so I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sabaya. Our final speaker today is Dr. Paul Hesketh, who serves as chair of SWOG's Professional Review Committee, which oversees research integrity and accountability within the group, a subject he will discuss today. Dr. Hesketh, the virtual podium is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Dr. Blanke for his very kind invitation to participate in today's session. I also want to extend my thanks to Connie Barnes from the SWOG Operations Office for her patience and help in answering my many questions as I prepared today's talk. I think we're all in agreement that if SWOG is going to continue to be a powerful and impactful presence in cancer research, we must constantly strive to ensure the highest level of integrity and ethical behavior in all of our activities. As illustrated by our other speakers today, our expectations with regard to research ethics and integrity should extend well beyond the traditional areas of concern, such as falsification of data, plagiarism, and unethical treatment of research subjects. Nevertheless, it is critically important that we continue to focus on these traditional areas as we affirm our commitment to maintain the highest level of research integrity. My primary focus today is to review the relevant current SWOG policies and expectations designed to ensure that we continue to maintain a level of excellence with regard to the ethics and integrity of our research efforts. I will begin with some background comments and then review relevant SWOG policies and then briefly provide my perspective on how we might expand our expectations with regard to ethical, professional, and interpersonal behavior beyond the traditional areas of concern that I will be reviewing today. My introduction to the critical importance of integrity in research occurred early in my career. My time as a fellow in hematology oncology was spent at Boston University Medical Center. Just 3 years prior to starting my fellowship, BU was embroiled in a significant controversy when the chief of medical oncology was accused by his research team of fraudulent data submission. This was prominently reported on by multiple local and national media outlets. This included a 5-part series produced by the Spotlight team of the Boston Globe. BU at the time was a main member institution in ECOG. The fallout from this scandal was significant, including the resignation of the chief of medical oncology, the departure of a number of additional staff members, the expulsion of BU from ECOG, the institution of a new periodic auditing process by ECOG of its member sites, and ultimately a series of congressional hearings. By the time that I started my fellowship, cooperative group trial participation had again started with BU now a member of CALGB. But the memory of those terrible events remained fresh in the minds of staff members, and the importance of maintaining the integrity of our research efforts was continually reinforced by my mentors during my fellowship years. The consequences of unethical research behavior are many. Most important is the risk of causing patient harm. In addition, it is likely that such behavior will lead to a loss of trust in all key constituencies, including patients and their families, the medical community, and the general public. The ultimate consequence of research misbehavior is its effect in slowing the rate of scientific progress. Unfortunately, it seems that essential changes in the process of regulatory oversight often occurs only after prominent misdeeds come to light. That was certainly the case with the BU research misconduct case, but it also followed an even more prominent scandal. On March 13, 1994, an article appeared in the Chicago Tribune detailing for the first time publicly the misconduct of a prominent breast surgeon participating in clinical trials run by the NSABP. A surgeon at Montreal's St. Luke's Hospital had supplied fraudulent data for more than 10 years on the landmark clinical trial B06 that compared lumpectomy with or without radiation with simple mastectomy. That surgeon had contributed nearly 20% of the total cases in that study. The reaction to this news article was swift and furious, and in the same month of March 1994, recruitment of patients to all NSABP studies was suspended, and Dr. Bernard Fisher was forced to resign as the NSABP principal investigator. A formal investigation was subsequently conducted by a U.S. House of Representatives subcommittee, and the practical fallout of this episode on the conduct of clinical trials in the United States was profound. Among the developments was the significant tightening of federal oversight of clinical trials, the initiation of surprise audits, more frequent routine audits, and a requirement that NCI be immediately notified of any evidence of scientific misconduct. As a direct consequence of the events engulfing the NSABP, the other NCI-supported cooperative groups were charged by NCI to strengthen their oversight procedures for their clinical trials. At the April 1995 group meeting, the group chair, Charles Coleman, announced two initiatives to help ensure the integrity of SWOG's research efforts. First, a new policy entitled Affirmation of Integrity was announced. And secondly, Dr. Coleman proposed the creation of a professional review committee, and among its duties would include a role in helping to oversee research integrity. So Policy 36 has four basic purposes. First, to try to remind group members of their ethical obligations for integrity in the conduct of clinical trials. Secondly, to inform group members of the consequences of failing to meet those standards. Thirdly, to assure group members that handle data that they are aware of and able to correctly utilize procedures to communicate concerns that they have about potential research misconduct to the group. And finally, to inform the relevant personnel of the need to submit the required Form FDA 1572. This policy applies to all individuals in SWOG, investigators, and everyone involved in SWOG activities. If there is a suspicion of falsified data, it requires an immediate telephone call to the Quality Assurance Department at the Ops office. Failure to comply with this policy could result in potential suspension of ability to register patients on our group trials, and ultimately a loss of ability to participate in any activities of SWOG. In the fall of 2020, the policy was revised with the requirement to sign the Affirmation of Integrity form was removed with the elimination of SWOG's new investigator credentialing process, given its redundancy with NCI's new required new investigator registration and credentialing processes. So the primary group in SWOG that is charged with reviewing and investigating any allegations of research misconduct is the Professional Review Committee. As previously noted, Dr. Coltman proposed the creation of this committee at the spring 1995 group meeting. At the subsequent fall meeting in 1995, the Board of Governors amended the bylaws to establish a Professional Review Committee, initially chaired by Dr. Jeffrey Weiss. At the fall meeting in 2005, the duties of the PRC were significantly expanded with regard to procedures to oversee research integrity, and Dr. Primo Lara was named as the new committee chair. 3 years later, I took over for Dr. Lara as committee chair, and in April of 2019, the responsibilities of the PRC were again updated, but continued to include the important details relating to oversight of research integrity. So in addition to Policy 36, the other SWOG policy that was specifically established to help ensure the integrity of our research efforts is Policy 41. This was first rolled out in the spring of 2003 group meeting with the title Misconduct, Debarment, or Other Administrative Actions. And the initial version specified the processes by which group investigators would be continually monitored. At the fall 2004 meeting, the policy was revised. Additional wording was added to highlight expectations with regards to research integrity and require that any data irregularities that were identified through quality control procedures be immediately reported to the group chair. At the fall meeting in 2005, the policy was significantly expanded with two primary revisions. One was to mandate reporting of allegations not only to the group chair, but to the PRC. And secondly, to detail the specific procedures that would be followed when allegations of scientific misconduct were made. The title was then appropriately revised to reflect the expanded responsibilities of the PRC. In the fall of 2020, there was a revision of the policy to reflect the elimination of SWOG's new investigator credentialing process. In the next few slides, what I'd like to do is to briefly outline the essential elements of Policy 41. So SWOG monitors 4 HHS website bulletin boards, as well as the World Bank website for any misconduct, debarment, suspension, or other administrative actions taken against one of our investigators. FDA has 2 sites, the Office of Research Integrity and the Office of the Inspector General each have a single site. Investigators that will be assuming the role of a principal investigator for an institution are also screened against all of these websites prior to their approval. If any action has been taken against an active group investigator, the investigator will be notified by the group chair that their privileges to register patients may be temporarily suspended or permanently withdrawn by the group, depending on the type of action that has been levied against the investigator. Policy 41 specifically defines research misconduct. So it would include any type of fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting research results. So if a group member believes that an individual has engaged in research misconduct, then basically they are required to immediately contact the Quality Assurance Department at the Ops office. The Ops staff will report the initial allegation to the group chair and to the PRC. To the extent that we are allowed by law, the PRC and really any involved individuals should be maintaining confidentiality. The PRC is then charged to do several things to assess the allegation. First of all, they have to determine, does it meet the definition of research misconduct? Does it involve federally supported research or applications for research? And ultimately, is the allegation sufficiently credible and specific so that potential evidence of research misconduct may be identified? So if an allegation meets the above criteria, then the PRC is charged to conduct an inquiry and then potentially conduct an investigation and to ultimately report the allegation. So the initial responsibility of the PRC is to conduct an inquiry and prepare an inquiry report. The respondent will be given a reasonable opportunity to comment on that report. And the inquiry process should ideally be completed within 60 days. The PRC will then make a written determination of whether a formal investigation is warranted. If the PRC determines that an investigation is warranted, then they will begin the investigation within 30 calendar days of that determination. It is at this point that the PRC will send the inquiry report and notify the Office of Research Integrity. The investigation should ultimately be completed within 120 days of its inception, and the respondent will be notified in writing of the investigation, the specific allegations, and be scheduled for an interview to respond to those allegations. The PRC will then prepare a draft and final group investigation report in writing, and ultimately a finding as to whether their conclusion is that research misconduct did or did not occur. The respondent will be given a copy of the draft investigation report and provided an opportunity to submit written comments, which will be included in the final report. If the investigation ultimately leads to a determination that research misconduct has occurred, the PRC will cooperate with relevant federal agencies to carry out any administrative actions that HSS may decide to impose. The PRC will report to the Board of Governors any actions that it proposes to be taken, and ultimately the Board of Governors will then vote on either accepting the proposal of the PRC and or taking any additional actions against the respondent. So I hope that my comments this afternoon have reinforced the critical importance of maintaining the highest standards of research integrity and provided you with a basic understanding of the key policies that SWOG has developed to ensure integrity, accountability, and ethical behavior in SWOG's research activities. But clearly, we need to do more. If we truly aspire to exhibit the highest ethical standards, we need to do more than simply avoid misconduct in our research activities. We need to expand our expectations with regards to ethical, professional, and interpersonal behavior. I think a number of actions could be taken to help achieve that goal. First, I think we need to think more creatively to try to expand the diversity of our study populations. Clearly, there are a number of important activities underway to try to do so. But if we are successful with those efforts, clearly the results of our research will more realistically reflect the real world and then hopefully be more generally applicable. Clearly, if we are successful with this effort, the support within the general population for our activities will be greater, and clearly the support from the government in terms of our activities will be greater. And I think most importantly, if we are successful with this effort, this will ultimately hopefully improve the outcomes in historically understudied populations. I think secondly, we need to redouble our efforts to be more inclusive in group education, mentoring, and leadership development efforts. And finally, I think we need to continually prioritize the need to demonstrate respect for our colleagues. First, by acknowledging and expressing gratitude for their contributions. And I think very importantly, to understand the critical need to honor professional boundaries. So I thank you very much for your attention today, and I look forward to our panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hesketh, and thanks to all our speakers for an absolutely wonderful set of presentations. We now have an opportunity to discuss the subject of integrity and ethical behavior in cancer research with an eye towards SWOG, with a panel of our three presenters, as well as Dr. Lisa Kachnik, Chair of Radiation Oncology at Columbia University, who is our SWOG Executive Officer for Multimodality Research. Dr. Kachnik is someone with deep experience in developing and refining institutional policies for addressing misconduct, policies she has helped establish at a number of different sites. So Drs. Kachnik, Jagsy, Subbiah, and Hesketh, thank you so much for joining us live. I'm going to moderate this panel discussion. Anybody viewing can submit questions to me via the chat or Q&A functions, and I will pose questions to panelists. And a couple actually rolled in during our presentations themselves, and they're good ones. Our first one is important. I don't think the writer was talking about harassment occurring in community sites versus academic sites. I think he was talking about opportunities. So particularly Dr. Jagsy, can you talk about how we advance the role of women in the workplace in a community setting and not just centered on academics?
Absolutely. So many of these challenges that I discussed in terms of gendered expectations of society and overt discrimination and harassment and unconscious bias obviously permeate well beyond academia's walls. And so it is very important for us to understand the landscape of experiences of individuals in community practice. And I feel really bad, Dr. Subbiah, is it Dr. Subbiah or Dr. Subbiah?
Subbiah.
Subbiah. So I've been mispronouncing your name.
We covered all the
conversation
here, so no worries.
We're usually on a first name basis. I really suck. So as Dr. Subbiah very nicely presented, we did actually try to seek out the perspective of community oncologists in that ASCO survey. And unfortunately, we do see these experiences are really quite widespread beyond academia.
Does anybody else wish to comment?
I think the same framework of accountability that we build for, even if it's in an academic environment, the reality is that the culture pervades through all settings of practice. And so if there is a culture of unacceptability of behaviors that are problematic, part of our advocacy efforts is to ensure that that does cover all settings of oncology. Because even if a study is done in an academic setting, these are issues that are relevant to every corner of our field.
Fantastic. You guys heard earlier in the presentation about SWOG's interest in having a vice chair for DEI. After we actually wrote the job description, someone commented that it sounded more like a senior staff admin position, although I think it's probably more important to that. Do you have any views on which makes more sense, and what do you think should be the first and most important duty for this new officer of whatever type they are? Lisa, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I can comment only because I actually was just part of a search at Columbia where I work my day job. I think it's more the individual and not the role they play in whatever institution they're at. So I believe it's someone who's well respected. They have a high level of administrative experience, but they have a demonstrated ability to be empathetic, to be open, to be impartial. They're going to have a lot of conflict management. So these characteristics are super important. And I think their mindset always has to be on a focus of supporting growth and positive change. I believe that probably two most important things that they need to do to start getting the culture change rolling is to develop transparent policies within SWOG, and then education and socialization of those said policies. But it's really about, again, having this culture and creating this culture of trust, equity, and inclusion. So to me, it's more about the individual not necessarily physician or not physician or whatever their current day job is, as long as they have these personal characteristics and have some administrative experience, especially with conflict management.
Lovely. Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to chime in and add, I completely agree. And I have seen such visionary leadership by both faculty members and staff in this space. And I don't think it's it's not the background, it's really the commitment, the time, and the expertise, which really is not something we learned in medical school anyway. But I have noted when we just this past year named for our department an associate chair for diversity, equity, inclusion, and wellness, that there has been so much. And my own department chair said, because I do study this stuff, right? And I am the deputy chair of my department. So maybe this could just fall under the general stuff I did. And I said, no, I really think we need a designated person. And just in the short year that we've had Dr. Kelly Parody in that role, who's a medical physicist, so she's not an MD, but she's a faculty member, partnered together with the co-chair of our DEI committee, who is a staff member. They have made such incredible changes, really transforming the culture of our working environment in meaningful ways, that our chair said, you were right. You weren't doing this at all by yourself. This is what happens when you designate someone with this specific focus. So glad that SWOG is going to do that.
It's great. It's like you guys are feeding me the questions, and I promise you're not, but it just leads nicely into what I wanted to ask and others wanted to ask you. I think we all have seen examples of local institutions that have appointed a new chair of DEI or vice chair of DEI. Are there examples of research organizations that have appointed new positions or adopted measures with really strong expectations for interpersonal behavior that you guys know about? The answer may be no. But
yeah, I think SWOG is leading the way in this regard. Certainly there are professional societies that are strengthening the not only the expectations of professional conduct and what professionalism should look like, but having very specific policies that pertain to, for example, behavior at meetings. And developing, there've been some wonderful initiatives by the astronomy allies when they discovered, leave it to astronomers to be smart enough to figure out what's going on, right? They're really brilliant people. They figured out that a lot of the harassment was going on at their in-person meetings, that there were poster sessions with a little bit of alcohol involved, and people were coming up and leering at the person presenting the poster, and the person presenting the poster was thinking, this is the only person qualified to review my work when it comes time for me to be tenured. So what the heck am I supposed to do? And they've developed this whole organization of astronomy allies who can actually come and confidentially, they're not mandated reporters, can help out in a difficult situation, right? If Lisa Kashnik walks up to me while someone is leering at me or Dr. Subaya and says, I have a pre-existing meeting with them, I need to steal them away. No one's gonna object to Lisa Kashnik doing that, right? And so there are people who are sufficiently important who can walk up to you and rescue you from those kinds of situations. And so they've developed like a list of who the allies are. And ASTRO, our professional society in radiation oncology, ASCO have some very active work in this space, but I don't know of any other research organizations. So again, I think SWOG is at the leading edge, as it should be and always is.
So Dr. Jackson, that's really interesting. It sounds like you're suggesting the person rescuing do so in a non-confrontational way. I happen to study a lot of martial arts where they say, even if you know how to defend yourself, don't attack somebody attacking somebody else. Go up and say, hey, you're late for our meeting. Is that truly how you're suggesting we effectively stop this type of behavior in a one-on-one situation?
It is one of many ways of bystander intervention. I will emphasize that the evidence is not fully developed in terms of the effectiveness of bystander intervention. We are all so hopeful that turning bystanders into upstanders is the solution. Again, the science is still developing in that space to look at the impact of various forms of bystander intervention, but there are different behaviors people can have. So one is removing the target from the situation. And again, that's the kind of behavior that can actually be taken by anyone in the organization, whether they're very senior or very junior, right? A way to remove a target of harassment, if you're seeing it occur, if you're very junior, is to say, hey, I've got a phone call on line 3, or there's a patient in room 9 that really needs your help. I'm really sorry to interrupt. I think they said it's the dean. and then, the person gets out of the situation, answers the phone, and you've removed the target. But there are also, there's the ability to provide support to the target of the harassment after the experience. And then for those who are privileged enough to have more influence and authority within organizations, there is the opportunity to be an ally and an advocate in a more direct way, to confront the individual who has perpetrated behavior that is not consistent with the values of the institution. Again, sometimes it is more of a questioning beginning. My favorite word, if you ever hear me say the word curious, it means you've done something that worries me, is I'm curious. I'd like to understand, here's what I observed, or here's what I heard. I'm curious because it doesn't really sync with my understanding of you and your values, or of our organization and our values. Can you tell me what was going on? Can we think through? Because my perception was that the impact, again, because there's often a different intent than there is impact. We have to focus on the impact, that the impact of that behavior on the person you were interacting with could have been quite damaging, right, as Dr. Sabaya has shown. So I think those are different levels of intervention, and they can go all the way up to, of course, formally reporting and making sure that there is, remediation, which for really egregious, tip of the iceberg behaviors is almost always indicated. Sometimes for the bulk base of the iceberg, gender harassing behaviors, there may be an opportunity to have a cup of coffee with someone to, take that. Yeah, Dr. Cashing knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? To remediate that behavior. The Vanderbilt program that has come up with that cup of coffee technique, says that the vast majority of misbehavior and unprofessional conduct can be addressed through relatively low levels of intervention. And for us to transform the culture, if the majority of men and women alike are experiencing these behaviors in the past year, it can't be a zero tolerance, we fire every single person for their first trespass.
Right.
What we have to do is we have to change the culture, we have to change expectations, we have to change understanding, and build a new future.
Lovely, lovely. This is a really great question. SWOG is made up of a bunch of volunteers who are members of either community or university organizations that have their own HR, their own set of rules, et cetera. How do we complement the rules? How do we integrate our rules with the existing functions of those other healthcare systems when transgressions do occur?
The reality is when transgressions come on any of our radars, it is the top of the iceberg actions. And so our professional societies have stepped up and made statements, taken action in those contexts. And I do value that tremendously, because you see the consequences of essentially expulsion from the oncology community because that person truly doesn't prescribe to our non-negotiable values. And so the key is, how do you extend that messaging to include the bottom of the iceberg as well? Again, with the caveat that remediation is possible with the right intervention, right setting. So it's really not about a scarlet letter. It's more about recognizing that the middle of the iceberg and the bottom of the iceberg behaviors are equally unacceptable. And so that, starting with awareness that it is not acceptable, by having sessions like this, to have forums like this, it makes a world of difference.
And I think it's, you stated it so well, it's awareness, but it's also accountability. So each of our organizations have to sort of have our own consequences, hopefully aligning with our national societies. But then, as I was mentioning, our new leader in this will have to educate and socialize so that we can create a culture of trust that, if you report something, it will be addressed. And just as we're describing this sort of pyramid of aggressions or behaviors, each level will have a consequence. And again, trying to promote that culture of trust, acceptance, and respect.
Yeah, and just to springboard off of what you just said, Dr. Kashnik, so important to transform that culture to prevent the behaviors in the first place, because what we do know from 3 decades of organizational psychology research on workplace harassment is that reporting is exceptionally uncommon. And as Dr. Sabaya said, it's often those tip of the iceberg things that reach the point of reporting. And yet all of these behaviors are corrosive to our ability to pursue our mission. And so we have to actually change those factors in the water to prevent the iceberg from forming. Saying, hey, there's an iceberg ahead, it's too late.
Speaking of which, so the top of the iceberg, really gross sexual misconduct, coercion is horrible. Most of the iceberg itself is pretty bad. Sexual harassment, rude jokes that have these long-lasting consequences we heard about from Dr. Subbiah. What about bullying? This is something I'm very sensitive to with my daughter in high school. How do we really define it, determine when it occurs? How do we punish that, address this consistently?
I mean, there are validated questionnaires that assess workplace bullying. There is a colleague at Cincinnati Children's, Maya Iyer, who has a grant to look at workplace bullying right now that I'm mentoring her on. And it is indeed a related but distinct phenomenon. And it is important to recognize that incivility in general is the water in which the specific gendered iceberg of sexual harassment forms, right? We have to have a climate of respect. And how do we do that? There's actually some really interesting, so here's some more evidence-based stuff. There actually have been initiatives, workshops to promote civility and respect that have been demonstrated in a Canadian hospital setting to have a real and durable impact on culture. And so those are the kinds of initiatives that we have to have, not the formulaic, a training that everyone has to attend for 5 minutes and they watch it online and they watch it in fast forward and, they check off some, obligatory questions, but rather instead of the pro forma trying to obey regulations, really a genuine attempt to change culture. And again, by hiring someone focused on this, that's how you make that kind of proactive change.
So Dr. Jackson, please go ahead.
I was going to say it was interesting at Vanderbilt. We actually used the simulator for the surgeons to have team simulations on sort of respect and proper behaviors in the moment. So we'd have sort of short vignettes that we kind of acted out and how you respond to it and what's the proper way to respond. It was quite interesting in the departments that underwent these team simulations. Sort of the pre and post surveys over the next year really showed some positive culture change.
You beat me to it, Lisa. I was thinking about the Socratic method in medicine, which of course was super heavy when I was training. I was thinking about all our poor surgical programs. How are they all surviving? Since I think probably 80% of what they used to do would be considered bullying.
I think they're actually, I honestly, with respect to our surgical colleagues, I actually have to say that in many respects, a lot of the leadership that I've seen in this area, maybe because things were just so bad in surgery, but has come from our surgical colleagues. And again, this idea of continuous quality improvement and applying that plan, do, study, act frame, it really does mesh well with the way that our surgical colleagues, especially those in health services research and quality improvement, have viewed the world for a long time. So they've been doing fascinating work about, aggressions that occur in a variety of different contexts and perpetrators and how to change the culture. So I think we can actually turn to them for inspiration, even though we could in the past have turned to them for appalling examples.
I like the inspiration. That's great.
Several ORs have safe words now. So, and it's almost like the timeout. So if someone feels that the behavior is not going in the proper direction, the safe word is stated, and it just reminds everybody of what they learned in the simulation.
Wow. That's fantastic.
That's very interesting that it actually triggers education back to the simulation. This concept of having a dedicated office within the institution that is appropriately funded and empowered and powered to oversee professionalism at the institution is an absolute must. And one of the highlights of the pandemic for me was our institution setting up the Center for Professionalism, Standards, and Safety that was modeled after the Vanderbilt system and so many others who are leading the way. It's not having to reinvent the wheel. If the framework of practice, if the framework of day-to-day activities are common across large-scale institutions, we need to be coming together over how do we include accountability into the culture rather than as an afterthought or a side recommendation.
Fantastic. And I think that'll lead us to our final question, again, quite nicely, and perhaps starting with Dr. Hesketh. Paul, you talked a lot about classical research misconduct, plagiarism, false data. You educated us so nicely about policy 41, but then you put out a call for an anti-harassment policy. How does SWOG develop that? Is it in parallel with what we already have? Are we going to be forced to recreate the wheel? And in the meantime, if somebody does see, let's say, bullying, for example, do they go to that same 24-hour number in ops to report it?
Well, I think, again, if someone can sort of put my video on, I've been really fascinated. I've been watching this session and learning a tremendous amount. My co-panelists have been fantastic, and this has been really educational. So I think that, what we need to do, Dr. Blanke, is I think we need to go well beyond the traditional PRC because we have a well-defined mandate, we have a well-defined process, and hopefully my talk gave you a little bit of an insight into what that process is. But obviously, in terms of professional and ethical responsibility, we need to do so much more than simply not plagiarize, not do
Yes.
problems with our research. And I think our two other speakers have illustrated that tremendously today. So I think that, what we need to do is really have a process by which we define how SWOG is going to deal with this in terms of, do we have sort of a separate entity, an individual, or some kind of process by which people, if they view something within the context of a SWOG meeting or a SWOG activity, they have a recourse. They have someone that they can go to. They have a defined process as to how that's going to be dealt with. I think clearly it has to go well beyond the bounds of the PRC committee because we have a very, very narrow focus on the traditional scientific integrity. And it's a new world. I mean, we need to be much more inclusive in terms of what we consider to be unethical or unprofessional behavior. And I think that's going to require a very wide tent. I think, the concept of maybe even putting some type of a task force together to try to define, what that process is going to be, I think would be very useful. And then have some education of the group as to what the resource is, what the process is, and then people will feel comfortable bringing forth any concerns that they have.
Thank you. Our panelists brought up a very important point, and so if we go a minute over, please forgive me, and hopefully the Zoom won't just end. Dr. Sabaya asked, reflecting audience questions about incivility affecting non-physician members of the workforce. So Dr. Sabaya, since you raised the point and called my attention to it, you get to comment first.
Note to self, always ask questions that you have answers to, right? So our particular study was designed that way from an academic perspective, right? We wanted a relatively homogeneous population to capture their experience. What you've heard, the overarching message in so many of Dr. Jagsi's work is the intersectionality between the one behavior versus another, one setting versus another. And so a problematic behavior, in this case, if it's sexual harassment, you're absolutely right. It is not a problem exclusive to one role in the medical community. So by identifying the perpetrators, you are truly impacting the workplace experience of that entire microcosm. Now, the association between one problematic behavior versus another is established in the organizational psychology literature. So just because a person may not be sexually harassing that part of the team, they may have other maladaptive behaviors that those teams are experiencing the consequences of. So we are all incentivized in the right way to get to the roots of the problems the moment that they're identified, because it could be the proverbial tip of the iceberg in the usual way.
I'll just add that, it's the ambient harassment is so problematic. And we do have some data emerging. The University of Michigan has used that same study design to survey physicians in our workplace, but we've also surveyed our nurses. And we're now in the field right now surveying the staff, because you can just only imagine how disempowered and vulnerable an individual who comes in to take the garbage out from a room is when they're alone. This has already been shown for hotel maids, that they're just exposed to, literally exposed to just unbelievable things. And so we need to understand how this is happening, because we basically run a hotel, among other things that we do in our practice. So much more work for us to do together. Couldn't thank you enough for that question. Yeah.
And I can't thank the panel enough, Drs. Kachnik, Hesketh, Jagsi, and Sabaya, for an absolutely crucial conversation. I am going to close out the general plenary for our fall 2021 SWOG group meeting. I want to thank all the attendees. I hope you enjoy the rest of the meeting. And I hope saying this doesn't jinx it again, but I hope to see you at our group meeting face to face. So here's looking to Seattle in April. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
So long.